What would you sacrifice? Your freedom, your future, the love you just found to teach your children that the truth matters more than comfort? The letter. Read twice. The letter arrived on the first Tuesday of November, folded twice and sealed with plain wax. Judson Dunning held it near the lamp and read it straight through. The handwriting was clean and upright, each letter formed with discipline rather than warmth. No flourishes, no wasted ink. Dear Mr. Dunning, I am writing in response to your advertisement in the Helena Independent. I am 31 years of age, in good health, and experienced in household management, cooking, mending, and the care of children. I have no family obligations that would prevent relocation. I am capable, reliable, and accustomed to hard work. If these qualifications suit your needs, I am prepared to travel to your ranch at the earliest convenience. Respectfully, Willa Avery. He set the letter on the table, picked up his coffee, drank it cold. Then he picked up the letter and read it again. Can I tell you what he noticed on that second reading? Not what she wrote, what she didn't. No mention of where she came from. No mention of family, living or dead. No warmth, no hope expressed. No soft phrases about companionship or building a life together. The other letters he'd received had carried those phrases like flowers pressed between pages, little offerings of tenderness from women eager for a fresh start. This letter carried none. Household management. Not, I love to keep a warm hearth, or I've raised my sister's babies and missed the sound of small feet. This woman wrote the way a person writes when every word might be examined, later measured, precise, leaving nothing exposed. Judson folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He stood and walked to the window. Frost had crept across the glass overnight, and through the clear patches he could see the south pasture stretching dark toward the tree line. The fence along that stretch had been broken since October. 3 posts down, wire sagging into the grass. He hadn't mended it. Every time he picked up the post driver, his hands went still and his stomach turned over. Couldn't bring himself to close the gap, beyond the fence, just visible where the ground rose behind the barn. The earth was dark and freshly turned. 6 weeks now, and the dirt still hadn't settled proper. Snow would cover it soon. Snow covered everything out here eventually. That was what a Montana man counted on. 3 children slept in the rooms above him. Arlo, 10, who had stopped talking about his mother and started talking like a man twice his age. Sadie, 7, who still set a place for Louise at supper and had to be gently reminded each evening. Nell, 4, who didn't remember her mother at all and asked no questions, which was its own kind of wound. He needed help. A man could run a cattle ranch alone, but he could not run a cattle ranch and raise 3 children and carry what he was carrying and survive the winter whole. Pride was a luxury for men with fewer obligations. He sat down at the table and wrote back. 1 word past the necessary yes. What the ground remembers, 3 weeks before the letter arrived. The drifter came through the gap in the south fence. Judson found him at first light, a man folded against the barn wall like something the October wind had deposited and forgotten. Thin coat, no hat, skin the color of tallow. His breathing came in shallow pulls that rattled deep in his chest like a stone rolling inside a dry barrel. Easy now, Judson said, kneeling. Let's get you inside the barn. He half carried the man through the wide door and laid him on the hay near the calving stove. Built a fire. The man's forehead burned under Judson's palm like a river stone left in coals. His eyes were open but seeing nothing in this world. The fever was already too deep. Judson knew it the way any man who'd wintered alone with cattle knew it, that glassy stare. The trembling that came not from cold, but from something cold couldn't touch. He brought water. Broth from last night's pot, carried careful across the dark yard. A wool blanket from the house, moving quiet past the children's room so the floorboards wouldn't speak. The man talked once, his voice like sand on dry wood. Don't send me back. Then the fever swallowed his words whole and turned them to moaning and silence. He died before dawn. The rattling stopped mid-breath and the barn went so quiet Judson could hear mice moving in the hay and the wind pressing against the walls outside. Judson sat with him a long while. Then he searched the man's coat. Not for valuables, there were none. A name was what he wanted, something to carve on a marker. What he found instead were papers folded tight into the coat lining, a warrant, horse theft out of Bozeman. The name William Party meant nothing to Judson, but the seal of the federal territorial court meant everything. He had sheltered a fugitive, unknowing, yes. Out of mercy, yes. But the law didn't always parse the distance between harboring and helping. And Judson had 3 children who needed their father at the breakfast table, not sitting in a courthouse explaining why a wanted man had died under his roof. He buried the stranger behind the barn, dug the grave himself in the October rain, the clay already stiffening toward winter. He spoke words over the mound, not a prayer exactly, but an acknowledgement that this man had drawn breath and stopped, and somebody ought to stand witness. He smoothed the earth flat with the back of the shovel blade. He told no one. The broken fence stayed broken. He could not bring himself to close the gap a dead man had walked through. The stage from Helena. The stagecoach pulled into Elkhorn 2 weeks before Christmas, and Judson was waiting on the platform with 3 children who had been scrubbed, combed, and threatened into their best behavior. Arlo stood with his hands jammed deep in his coat pockets, jaw set, watchful as a barn cat. Sadie clutched a pine cone she intended as a welcome gift, turning it over and over in her mittens. Nell held Judson's finger and stared at the stamping horses with her mouth open. The coach door swung wide and a woman stepped down onto the frozen planks. She was not what he'd pictured. The other letters, the ones he hadn't answered, had described women who sounded soft, eager, grateful. This woman planted her boots on the boards with her spine straight as a fence post and her eyes already cataloging the street. The roof lines, the alleys between buildings. Her hands were calloused, but the calluses were wrong too, even too deliberate, like hands that had gripped something heavier and more specific than a rolling pin. She carried a leather bag in one hand and a folded handkerchief in the other. The handkerchief had weight to it. She held it the way a person holds something they can't put down and can't explain. I ordered a cook, Judson thought, not a woman with a badge. He didn't know about the badge yet, but every instinct told him this woman had spent long seasons watching for trouble and positioning herself with exits at her back. "I'm Willa," she said. "I can cook, clean, and manage a household. That's what you asked for." "That's what I asked for," Judson said. Nell released her father's finger and reached up for Willa's hand. No invitation, no hesitation. The child's fingers wrapped around 2 of Willa's, and Willa looked down at them. Her grip tightened once around Nell's hand, the only movement she made. But it was enough. Something surfaced in her face and went back under, fast as a trout in shallow water. Sadie held out the pine cone. "I found it by the creek. It's for you." "Thank you," Willa said. "I'll keep it." Judson loaded her bag into the wagon. They rode toward the ranch in near silence, the children's chatter softening as the cold settled in. As the wagon turned up the property road, the grave behind the barn passed on the left. Dark turned earth against the early snow, unmistakable to anyone who knew what freshly dug ground looked like. Willa's gaze tracked across it, paused 1 full second, and moved on. A marshal notices disturbed ground. Judson didn't know that yet either. The star she couldn't throw away 6 months before she sealed that letter to a Montana rancher. Deputy Marshal Willa Avery stood on a cliff's edge in the rain and stared down at the place where Benjamin Coulter's body had come to rest among the rocks. Here's what Willa never told a soul. She didn't miss when she reached for him. She was close enough to count the stitches on his sleeve. He looked at the badge on her coat, and he pulled his hand away. He chose the fall over her grip, and she has carried that refusal like a brand pressed to the underside of her ribs ever since. The warrant had been lawful. Coulter was wanted for assault on a territorial official, not a hanging offense, but serious enough for federal interest. Willa had served papers on harder men in harder country, and she'd done it clean every time. But Coulter was beloved in his town, a schoolteacher, a deacon, the kind of man whose neighbors refused to believe the charges and refused, harder, to believe the woman who brought them. She tracked him to the ridge above Miller Creek on a morning when the shale was slick with rain, called out proper, showed the warrant. He bolted. She followed. At the edge he turned and she was right there, arm outstretched, fingers reaching for his wrist. He saw the star on her lapel, and he pulled away. The sound he made falling carried no scream, just sharp breath. Then nothing. Then the distant crack of a body meeting stone. The town buried Coulter on a Sunday. The minister spoke his name 7 times during the service. Nobody spoke Willa's name at all. Her superiors in Helena reviewed the incident, found her actions lawful, and quietly reassigned her to a desk where she could cause no further embarrassment. The commission wasn't revoked, it was simply emptied of meaning. She wrapped the star in a handkerchief the evening of the reassignment. Couldn't throw it away, the badge was who she had been. Couldn't wear it, the badge was what it had cost. She folded the cloth tight and carried it in her pocket like a wound she couldn't bandage and couldn't show. She found Judson's advertisement 3 days later. A widowed rancher needing a woman to keep house and mind 3 children. She wrote back the way she'd written case reports her entire career qualifications. Capabilities? No sentiment. She posted the letter before she could reconsider and walked back to her rented room with nothing left to lose but the weight in her pocket. First, snowfall. First, belonging. 3 days in, and the kitchen was someone else's territory. Willa had reorganized every shelf, every jar, every tin. Flour sacks stood in rows by weight. Spices were grouped by use. The children's coats hung on pegs near the door. Arranged by size, Arlo's on the highest hook, Nell's on the lowest, where small hands could reach without asking. A schedule appeared on the wall beside the stove meals, chores, wash days, written in that same upright hand from the letter. She runs this place like a cavalry officer, Arlo muttered at breakfast, low enough he thought only his father could hear. You complainin' about 3 hot meals and clean socks, Judson said. Arlo had no answer for that. The snow came on the 3rd evening thick, heavy, the kind that sealed a house shut and compressed the world to 4 walls and a hearth fire. Willa taught Sadie to braid bread dough at the kitchen table, their hands dusted white, Sadie's tongue poking out in concentration. Judson stood at the kitchen threshold with coffee cooling in his hand. Watching but not entering, as if crossing that invisible line would make whatever was happening too real to undo. Nell sat on the floor near the stove, arranging buttons into patterns only she understood. Arlo read in the corner, pretending not to listen. After supper, Willa told stories, not fairy tales, something richer, stories about travelers lost on mountain passes who found their way by listening to water, about women who carried dispatches through blizzards on horseback, about men who bridged canyons with nothing but rope, stubbornness, and the unwillingness to be beaten by empty air. She told them the way a person tells stories they've lived near with details too specific for invention. The children's eyes grew wide. So did Judson's, though he would sooner have bitten through his own tongue than admit it. Here's the thing about children, they don't read badges or gravestones. They read hearts. And Nell had made her decision before the first story ended. When the fire burned low and the stories wound down to silence, Nell fell asleep against Willa's side on the settee. Her head rested in the crook of Willa's arm, and Willa held very still, as if the child were something wild and sacred that might startle at any sudden breath. Judson brought a blanket, laid it across them both. His hand hovered above the wool a moment longer than necessary, close enough to feel warmth rising through the fabric without touching either of them, close enough that Willa could feel the nearness and didn't pull away. Their eyes met above the sleeping child. Neither spoke. There were no words yet for what was building between them, only the shared recognition that something in this house had shifted, and neither could shift it back. Outside, the snow buried the fence line and the grave equally. For one night, everything hidden stayed hidden, and the house held more heartbeats than it had in years. The sheriff's horse at dawn. The hoofbeats woke Judson before the light did. He was at the window in 3 heartbeats, and what he saw drove the warmth straight out of his chest. Sheriff Tom Driscoll's bay mare tied to the porch rail, breath steaming from her flanks in the gray cold. Willa was already in the kitchen, already dressed, already had coffee heating on the stove. She'd heard the horse before he had. I reckon that tells you something about the life she'd lived before this one. Driscoll sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Nell had fallen asleep against Willa the night before, and held his hat against his knee. He was a careful man, methodical, the kind of lawman who spoke soft and listened with his whole body. "Mornin', Judson, ma'am," he nodded to Willa. "Appreciate the coffee. What brings you all the way out, Tom?" "2 things." Driscoll sipped, took his time. The fire popped in the stove and nobody flinched. "First, we received word a drifter matching certain descriptions was tracked heading toward your property back in October. Man named William Party, wanted out of Bozeman on horse theft. You see anyone pass through?" The lie came smooth, and it sat in Judson's mouth like a river stone. "Ain't seen a soul, Tom. Been quiet out here." Driscoll nodded slowly, eyes steady on Judson's face. "Second thing, folks in town are talking about the new woman you've got out here. Say she carries herself unusual for a housekeeper." His gaze moved to Willa, who was pouring his second cup without a tremor in her fingers, without a blink, without a single tell that any trained eye could read. "No offense intended, ma'am. I follow up on what I hear. That's the whole of my job." "She's the woman I sent for," Judson said. "She cooks and minds my children. That's all there is to it." Driscoll studied Willa for a long 3 seconds. Willa held his gaze the way a person holds a gaze when they've been studied by harder men across harder tables. She set the coffee pot down, said nothing. Let the silence do its work. "Well." Driscoll stood, reached for his hat. "I expect I'll ride back out before long. That party business ain't settled in Bozeman's mind, and they're asking every sheriff in the territory to make inquiries." He set his hat on his head. "Much obliged for the coffee, ma'am. Fine brew." They watched him ride until horse and man were a single dark mark moving slow against the white. Willa turned from the window. "That man will be back," she said. Not a question. "I know," Judson said. The grave behind the barn sat under 6 inches of snow, but there wasn't enough winter in all of Montana to bury it deep enough. 2 truths at the kitchen table. The children slept. The house was quiet, and the silence between Judson and Willa had grown teeth. They sat across the kitchen table, lamp turned low, coffee untouched between them like something neither was brave enough to reach for. Judson studied his hands' cracked knuckles, dirt beneath the nails, the hands of a man who built things and buried things and carried the difference in his chest like a stone he couldn't cough up. Willa studied the wall behind his head, her face composed, her breathing even. Everything locked down tight the way she'd learned to lock it during 6 years of walking into rooms where men didn't want her. "Can I tell you something about silence between 2 people who are both hiding? It isn't peaceful. It hums. It presses against the walls like heat from a fire that's been banked too long, and it makes a room feel smaller with every breath that passes without words." Willa moved first. She reached into her dress pocket, drew out the handkerchief, and unfolded it on the table between them. The federal marshal's star caught the lamplight dull brass, scratched from years of service, heavy enough to make a sound when it met the wood, a sound like a door closing or opening, depending on which side you were standing. Judson looked at the star, looked at her. "My name is Willa Avery," she said. "I was a deputy marshal out of Helena for 6 years. I served a lawful warrant on a man named Benjamin Coulter last spring. He fell from a cliff. I reached for him and he pulled away from my hand." Her voice held steady. Her eyes did not. "The town called it murder. My superiors called it inconvenient. I wrapped this star and answered your advertisement because I needed to disappear into someone else's life. That's the truth of why I'm sitting at your table." The lamp flame didn't waver. The clock on the shelf ticked 14 times before Judson spoke. "There's a man buried behind my barn." Willa's expression didn't change. She was trained not to let it. "Drifter came through the gap in the south fence back in October. Fevered. Near gone already. I brought him into the barn. Tried to bring the fever down with water and broth and every remedy Louise ever taught me." He paused on his dead wife's name, just briefly, the way a man pauses when stepping over a crack in ice. "He passed before dawn, found warrant papers in his coat after William Party, horse theft out of Bozeman." His hands lay flat on the table, palms pressed hard against the grain, as if holding down something that might rise if he let go. "My children were sleeping upstairs. I buried him and I told no one, because a man who harbors a fugitive, even a dead one, risks his children sitting in a room while strangers decide if their father is fit to raise them." His voice cracked once, on the word children, and he let it crack without trying to patch it. "I will not allow that. And now I need to tell you what it costs when a person chooses the hard right over the easy wrong, because the price isn't paid in silver. It's paid in everything you've just started building." The star sat between them on the table like a third heartbeat. I can help you, Willa said quietly. I know the law. There are ways to present this that I don't want to hide anymore, Judson said. I want to know what's right. Willa touched the edge of the star with one finger. The right thing, she said, is the thing you can live with when your children are old enough to ask what you did. The wind shifted outside. Snow ticked against the window glass like fingernails tapping for entry. Tomorrow or the next day, the sheriff would ride back, and Judson already knew what he would do because a man who teaches his children to lie teaches them that truth has no value at all. The fence he chose to mend. Judson rose before the darkness lifted. He dressed in the cold room, moving quiet in his stockinged feet so the floorboards wouldn't give him away. Pulled on his boots at the door, took his coat from the peg, stepped outside into air so sharp it burned the lining of his lungs and made his eyes water before his second breath. He went to the barn first, stood at the grave. The wind had scoured the snow thin overnight, and the outline of turned earth showed through again, a dark shape against white, like a wound the land kept trying to close and couldn't. I did right by you, Judson said softly. You was dying and I took you in. I'd do it again tomorrow, but I can't carry the silence no more, not with them watching me and learning that a man can bury what troubles him and call it finished. He walked to the tool shed, took out 2 posts, a roll of wire, and the post driver. Carried them to the south fence where the gap had stood open since October, 3 posts down, wire trailing, the opening through which a stranger had stumbled and changed the shape of everything. He drove the first post into frozen ground. The impact rang across the silent pasture like a church bell with no church. Then the second post. He strung the wire tight between them, tested it with his palm, felt the vibration run up his arm. The gap closed. The fence line stood whole for the first time in 2 months. Some fences a man puts off mending because he ain't ready to seal what they let through. Judson was ready now. Back at the house, he tore a page from the feed ledger and wrote a note in pencil, set it on the kitchen table next to the marshal's star, which still lay where Willa had placed it the night before. The note was short. It said what needed saying and nothing beyond. He saddled his horse in the gray-violet light, tightening the cinch with hands that felt steadier than they had in weeks. Was checking the stirrup when the porch door creaked behind him. Arlo stood barefoot on the frozen boards, arms wrapped around his ribs against the cold. 10 years old and already wearing the face of a boy who understood that adults left and didn't always come back. "Where you going, Pa?" Judson tied off the cinch, walked to the porch, knelt so he was level with his son's eyes the same color as Louise's, the same worried slant at the corners. "I'm going to town to do something I should have done weeks ago." He put his hand on the boy's shoulder and felt the shivering run through him. "You mind your sisters. Willa's here. She'll keep you safe till I'm back." "You are coming back!" Judson pulled the boy against his chest and held him, felt the small heart hammering through the nightshirt like a bird against glass. "I aimed to, but you remember what I've taught you, son. A man tells the truth even when it costs him, especially when it costs him. That's the only fence that holds." He mounted, turned the horse south toward Elkhorn. Behind him, the mended fence stood straight and clean against the snow, posts driven true, wire singing faintly in the wind. The grave was still there, but the lie above it was gone. What the star became. Willa found the note beside the star. She picked it up and read it once. Then she read it again the same way Judson had read her letter back in November, searching the spaces between words for everything the words refused to carry. "Gone to tell Driscoll the truth about the grave. Take care of them. You were never just a cook, Jay." She stood alone in the kitchen with the note in one hand and the star in the other. The house breathed around her. Nell's soft snoring drifted from the room above. Sadie's arm hung off the edge of her bed, visible through the open door, fingers dangling loose in sleep. Arlo sat on the porch where his father had left him, coatless, staring down the empty road. Willa looked at the star in her palm. For 7 months she'd kept it wrapped in cloth, unable to wear it, unable to set it down. It had meant authority once, the right to stand in a room and speak with the weight of law behind her voice. Then it meant failure, then shame. Then nothing but dead weight in a pocket, carried across a territory and into another woman's life like a penance she hadn't been sentenced to but served anyway. She pinned it to her dress, not to arrest anyone, not to enforce a single statute, but because a man was sitting in a sheriff's office right now, telling the truth with his spine straight and his voice steady. And he deserved someone in that room who could speak for him in the language the law understood. She bundled the children to the Harper's ranch a mile east. Arlo didn't want to go. Pa said, "Mind my sisters." "And you will," Willa said, "but right now your father needs someone to mind him." She rode hard into Elkhorn. The cold burned her cheeks raw, and the star pressed against her collarbone through the wool of her dress like a second heartbeat, reminding her it was still there. By the time she tied her horse outside the sheriff's office, the sun was full up and the window glass glowed amber with lamplight. Through the glass she could see Judson sitting across from Driscoll, coat open, palms flat on his knees, talking. She walked in. The door hinges announced her. Both men looked up. Driscoll's eyes went to the star on her dress and stayed there. "My name is Willa Avery," she said. "I hold a deputy marshal's commission out of Helena, and I have information bearing on the matter of William Pardee." She spoke the language Judson couldn't. "Under territorial statute, Sheriff, rendering aid to a dying man does not constitute harboring regardless of what papers he carried. A fever that advanced leaves no time for warrant verification, and Mr. Dunning's actions are consistent with the duties of a good Samaritan, not an accessory." She described the condition Pardee would have presented: the delirium, the speed of the fever, the impossibility of identification. She spoke of Judson's character, his children, his voluntary confession, given freely before any accusation. Driscoll listened. Asked questions, wrote notes in a careful hand. He was a fair man. This would take time correspondence with Bozeman, perhaps a hearing, paperwork that moved slow as winter thaw. But a man who rides in and speaks the truth before anyone comes looking is not the same as a man dragged in by the collar. "I'll need him to stay in town a few days," Driscoll said, "while I sort the particulars." Judson nodded. He looked at Willa at the star pinned to her dress, the same star she'd wrapped in grief and hidden for 7 months. She stood wearing it like it had always belonged there, and something passed between them that neither needed to name. "You'll tell them the truth," he said. "That's what this family does now," she said. She rode home with his horse tied behind her. The saddle was empty. The mended fence stood against the winter sky as she passed it, posts driven clean, wire pulled tight, the gaps sealed, the work finished. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and steady, covering the turned earth behind the barn with white that looked, from a distance, like the land finally letting go. The children would ask where Pa went. She would tell them, not the easy version, the true one. Because Judson Dunning had taught her something no badge ever could, that the fences worth building are the ones you build knowing full well what they'll cost. Some fences you mend with posts and wire, some you mend with the truth, and the ones that hold longest are the ones that cost you something to build.